Hey guys, Ben Pollack here. To go along with today's video, I've got a free spreadsheet you guys can download. It's in the description below. It's a 10-week periodized program. Even if you don't want to follow it exactly as written, check it out so you can learn a little bit more about how I implement periodization, get some ideas for how to do it in your own programs. Again, totally free, so pass it around, friends, family, whoever, and I hope you enjoy it.
First row, take one, pass it back for me.
Okay, we're getting close to the end. A quick recap of what we've done so far. We've covered volume and intensity and frequency, your three major programming variables. We've also covered exercise selection, right? So we have competition lifts, variations, and supplemental movements. And then we've covered our training split. We're going to talk about the last major thing, and that's our percentage breakdown, our loading parameters. So we're going to start with the different types of periodization. If you think back to the very first part of this video, we talked about how over time you should decrease your volume and increase your intensity so your body can continue to supercompensate for your training. This is what's known as linear periodization or traditional periodization, where you have a very gradual decrease in volume and increase in intensity. There are also other ways that you can periodize your program that can be very effective, maybe even more effective depending on your own body and your own reaction to training. The first kind of major other type of periodization is called block periodization. And this basically is divided into three phases: hypertrophy, strength, and power. And each phase is kind of a discrete block where you're focusing on one individual thing. So in hypertrophy training, obviously you're focusing on kind of muscular growth, and your percentages are going to be in the 55 to 75% range. You're going to be using a total of 12 to 30 repetitions per major exercise. Now, usually when you see traditional block periodizations written out, you'll see people using generally sets of 8 to 12 in hypertrophy phase. And that's because some research has shown that that rep range is more effective at promoting muscle growth. But really the core detail is how many total reps you're doing in that workout. It doesn't really matter if you're doing 5 sets of 6 to get your 30 reps or 3 sets of 10. It's going to be a very similar response in terms of your body. And actually some research shows that maybe more sets is more effective as opposed to higher reps. In the strength phase, you're working in the 75 to 90% range for 10 to 20 repetitions. And generally, you'll see sets of 3 to 5 reps used here. And then in the power phase, you're working at percentages greater than 90% with fewer than 10 total reps per working exercise. The power phase is generally shorter, so the hypertrophy and strength phases can be anywhere from, say, 3 to 6 weeks each. And then the power phase is generally 3 weeks or less, maybe 3 or 4 weeks. And that's because the power phase is more demanding. It's harder to recover from these very high percentages. Now, you should follow a complete block periodization cycle with a rest phase or restoration phase, where either you're taking time off from training or you're doing a very significant deload, where you can give your body time to heal before you then begin again in the hypertrophy phase. The third type of periodization that we're going to talk about is undulating periodization. We're actually not going to get to this today. But undulating periodization is a method where within a given microcycle, right, so within a given training week, you're using all three phases of block periodization. Over time, over the full length of your mesocycle, then you're still gradually decreasing volume and increasing intensity overall. Undulating periodization has been shown to be very effective, more effective than the other two, for advanced lifters. For intermediate and beginner lifters, it's about the same. And undulating periodization is very difficult to set up in terms of programming. So we're going to talk about that later. We're going to kind of save it. In terms of the differences between linear/traditional periodization and block periodization, I prefer traditional. That's because I find a lot of people with this type of setup where you have discrete training blocks, when you move from the hypertrophy phase to the strength phase, and especially from the strength phase to the power phase, people find it very difficult to make that switch because the percentage jumps, and just traditionally, it doesn't have to be this way, but traditionally, the percentage jumps are very big between blocks. And that can be very intimidating to people, both physically and mentally, because you haven't been practicing with kind of the heavier loads, and that's a skill. So, especially for kind of beginner and intermediate trainees, I find that if they don't have a lot of practice, they're really not comfortable making those jumps, and so they find it very difficult and frustrating to try and transition through a progression like that. Whereas with linear traditional periodization, it's a little bit smoother. So we're going to take a look at each so that you can kind of get a feel for them and understand how to apply them to your own training. Okay, so here we have two different periodization schedules. On the left, we have the linear. The linear periodization. We're gradually moving from 75% to 95% and from 30 reps to 4 reps over the course of a 6-week training cycle. On the right, we have the block periodization. We're also moving from 30 reps at 75%, and we're going to 2 reps at 100%. Now, for the first week and the last week, there's almost no difference, but we'll see that in between, there's some variations. So here on the left, we go from 30 reps, 24, 18, 12, 9, and 4. And you can see the rep scheme, but again, the set and rep scheme, but again, what I'm focusing on is this total number of reps. And you can also see the percentages where we have jumps 75 to 80, 80 to 85, 85 to 90. Those are kind of big jumps, and then we scale it down and go 90 to 92, 92 to 95. Okay? So this is a very gradual progression. It's actually not that gradual because we're only working in 6 weeks, but for our purposes, it's gradual. On the right side, we start out at 30 and then 24, so this is the same. But then we jump down to 15, right? We're doing 3 sets of 5 instead of 3 sets of 6, and then our 12 is the same. But we go from 80 to 87.5, right? So that's a bigger jump over here, and then we end up at the same 90. This is the strength phase, hypertrophy phase, strength. And then in power, we have 4 reps and 2 reps compared to 9 and 4. That's a pretty big difference. And while 90 to 95 is still only a 5% jump, when you're working in percentages over 95, every little bit counts, because this is when people's form tends to break down. Is somewhere in the 85 to 90% range, that's when people really start to struggle and where the weaknesses really become apparent. So a set that you hit 80% no problem, then you jump up to 87 and 90, now all of a sudden, something that should have been easy in terms of a 1 rep max calculator, something like that, all of a sudden it's very difficult because technique becomes an issue where it wasn't before. And that's why I prefer the linear periodization method, especially if you're still starting out, you're still in kind of that beginner intermediate phase and you're not 100% confident in your technique, or at least 90% confident in your technique. I think you'll be better off this way. So something else I want to highlight is choosing the sets and reps. And what you'll find is it really doesn't matter. What you're focused on is this total number of repetitions. So here I've chosen sets of 10, 8, 6, 4, 3, 2, just kind of out of convenience almost, because it got me the total number of repetitions that I wanted. Now, I find that more sets takes me longer, and I find that with lower reps, I'm able to focus better on my form. With a set of 10, even though my form is pretty well dialed in, with a set of 10, I'm more focused on grinding through the set of 10 because it's a really long set. Whereas with a set of 5 or 4 or 3 or 2, it's a shorter set, and so I can really concentrate on doing each rep perfect. That's just kind of me, but I find a lot of people respond similarly, and I have a lot of time I can spend in the gym. I can afford to do that. If you have less time, you might find that, hey, doing fewer sets is more efficient, and that's perfectly fine. As long as you're starting out somewhere in, say, this 20 to 30 rep range, over time progressing down, somewhere, I would say somewhere between hitting your last week, 1 and 5 total, between 1 and 5 total reps is probably ideal. If you want to max out, that's fine, but you don't necessarily have to. But you do want to make sure that you're getting a pretty big difference between where you start your cycle and where you end it. And again, in terms of percentages, you want to start, honestly, you can start a lot lighter than 75, or you could go as light as 55. I generally start between 60 and 65%, and then you want to progress to at least over 90%, at least. But I prefer progressing to 100% or more, right? I try to set a new PR every time I go through a training cycle. These are both 6-week cycles. Again, that was kind of out of convenience. I think that it's better to do kind of longer cycles in the 12 to 16 week range, because that gives you both a little bit more flexibility and more time to adapt to the changes from week to week, right? So you don't have to have even 5% jumps, you can have 2 or 3% jumps. So again, sets and reps, it's mostly personal preference. Total number of reps needs to start high and end low. And percentages. Where did I get these percentages? I looked them up in a chart. I'm going to link to the chart below. But basically they correlate to your 1 rep max. You should be able to do sets of 10 with 75% of your 1 rep max. Sets of 8 with 80% of your 1 rep max. This can be kind of an all-out set, but that's generally around what you should be able to do. If you're just starting out, I recommend just grabbing a percentage sheet and just copying off of that. There's no reason to rewrite the book here, right? It's just like when we were talking about our split, bench squat, bench dead, right? It's popular for a reason. So it's a good starting point, and once you learn to adapt, you can adjust those percentages. That's what we're going to talk about next week. This is when things start to get interesting, right? So you can stick with kind of these standard percentages, but once you really start to adjust them, you really start to find out, okay, what sets and what rep ranges work for me the best. That's when you can really, really start to hone in your training. But that's what we're going to talk about next time. So we've covered a lot of topics in the last 4 videos. I want to show you how you can put them all together to really create a really efficient training program. If you're just starting out as a beginner, I think the ideal way to go about this is to start off with a linear progression program. Something like strong lifts, starting strength, any type of, usually there'll be 5x5 type programs. Any one of those that's well recommended is going to work perfectly fine. Stick with that linear progression, just adding 5 or 10 pounds a week until you stall, until you can no longer do that and still complete your required number of sets and reps. At that point, stick with the exact same training split, implement some type of periodization, right? So today we talked about linear and block periodization. Doesn't really matter which one you choose, but you start with around 30 total repetitions in week 1, working somewhere in the 55 to 70% range, and you can get those charts off online or in the description below. And then over time you progress until you're working in the very low repetitions, so between 1 and 5 for close to your 1 rep max, or you can even try to max out. After you've gone through that once or twice, you can start to adjust frequency. By frequency, we're talking about the training split itself. We're talking about how many times you're performing the individual competition lifts. We're talking about how many days per week you train. We're talking about what type of variations you're using. You make one change at a time, right? You stick with that for ideally 12 to 16 weeks, a full mesocycle, but at least say 4 to 6 weeks to see how kind of it affects your body. And then you can make another change and another change. This whole process can take you upwards of a year, right? This could be 1, 2, 3, as many as 5 years for some people. But if you get through this whole process, you're going to be really strong, and you're going to understand really, really well how your body works. Now, I know that a lot of you guys watching this video are probably already past this phase, right? You've probably been training for a long time, you probably have built a lot of strength, which is awesome, and you're probably ready to move on to something more advanced. By this stage of the game, if you followed all these videos, you have sufficiently unfucked your program. Your program is no longer fucked up. We're going to move on to making it fucking perfect, because there's a lot of different and more advanced techniques that you can implement into your training to make it super effective, to make it basically the perfect routine for you and for your individual body. And this is something that is impossible, literally impossible, with cookie cutter routines that you'll buy online, including my own, because if it's a cookie cutter routine, it's not written for an individual, and every individual is different. Every body responds differently. And learning how your body responds is the absolute key to realizing your full potential. So stay tuned, ask questions, and thanks for watching.